And I want to thank everyone for showing up to watch this show today. We've got a bit of a doozy, a totally non-controversial subject that we're going to talk about today.
Boring and non-controversial.
Yeah, totally boring. Not at all politically relevant. No, so let's get into it. And I've got a little sort of introduction here to set us up. So I will just sort of refer to that as we go. But there's a lot of people who I think are tuning in knows by now, there has been just a ton of controversy these days around the issue of what schools should or shouldn't be allowed to teach in relation to topics of sex, gender, and identity. And of course, one of the central fault lines for this particular culture war is running through the state of Florida, where we've seen a recent parents' rights bill that was passed by Governor Dissonance, which the left characterizes as a don't say gay bill, which is in effect limiting speech in the classroom. And this particular battle has gotten really, really heated over the last several weeks. The left accuses advocates of the bill as being homophobic, transphobic, sexist, etc. Meanwhile, the right is labeling the bill's critics as being groomers or even outright pedophiles. And, before we get into it, Keith, just for the sake of clarity, I've actually got the relevant part of the bill, which I'll read here just to sort of anchor the discussion. So what it says, this excerpt says, classroom instruction by school personnel or third parties on sexual orientation or gender identity may not occur in kindergarten through grade 3 in a manner that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate for students in accordance with state standards. Now, the problem with this language, of course, is that age appropriate, developmentally appropriate tends to be a fairly subjective thing, right? I mean, everyone has a different sort of concept of what age appropriate, developmentally appropriate looks like. And I can't think of anyone more qualified to actually give us a greater understanding of what actually is appropriate than yourself. So we're here today to explore this question, basically, of what does a developmentally appropriate, age appropriate approach to sex, gender, and identity look like as it pertains not only to kids in kindergarten to 3rd grade, but also throughout childhood and adolescence. And once we get a sense, Keith, of this overall approach, I'm hoping we can kind of expand the conversation a little bit so we can discuss which aspects of this approach are more appropriate to teach at home and which are more appropriate to teach at school. So like I said, totally not a big deal, guys. Not controversial at all. No one could possibly take any offense to any of the perspectives that we will be sharing today.
There you go. Okay. Well, first of all, there's two conversations here. And so I want to try to keep them a little bit separate.
Sure.
There's the political conversation. The political conversation is that there's one group that's basically red, amber, and cynical orange, which is the Republican Party. And there's another group which is basically responsible orange, green, and teal. And they struggle for power in the United States. And one of the most effective strategies of the right is to find an issue that alarms Amber, that makes Amber look like things are going to change. Because Amber doesn't want to change. Amber actually doesn't want things the way they are either. They want to go back to some idealized rosy past that really never existed, but that they imagine existed, kind of like the Amish. And so what red does, psychopaths and narcissists, they play on that to have power and wealth. And what the cynical orange does is, that's the oligarchy, they play on that to keep the extractive capitalist system going so that they can keep getting people to elect representatives that will support them so that they can continue to exploit the people. And that's why our healthcare outcomes, including sexual health, are lower than any other place in the civilized world.
Yes.
In the UN general gender equity scale, Holland, the Netherlands, the Dutch are third. The United States isn't even in the top 40. Okay? Mm. So there's a political agenda that really doesn't have anything to do really with what's right, what science tells us, what constitutes healthy development. It's just basically about power and money. And unfortunately now trans people are, just like gay people have historically been and Black people have been, they're now being targeted so that this group can maintain or gain more power and wealth. So that's the political part of it. Mm-hmm. And so everything else we're going to talk about today is irrelevant to that group. For instance, the cognitive dissonance for Amber of, the conservatives say, we want everybody to have independence and freedom and autonomy and make their own choices. And yet, whenever they have power, they take away choices. You can't choose to have an abortion, and you can't choose to answer questions honestly to children. And you can't choose to with the help of medical professionals and experienced people and your kids, find a way to help your trans-identified kid move forward in the world. And you can't talk about certain things. And there's certain books that you can't have and can't recommend to your kids, so on and so on. Also, so there's that, okay? And I have some strong feelings about this. My grandmother was one of the first teachers in LA, community college women teachers in LA, and she was fired for teaching about sexuality. My older brother and I, when we were 5 and 6, were taught by my biologist father about sex. We told our friends and told the kids at school, and everybody got in trouble. When my son was 17, he asked me to lecture his AP history class about sexuality and intimacy, and I went and we had a great time. And the teacher almost got fired, and I got complaints and could have had a lot of trouble because with 17-year-old kids, even in California, I needed to get signed releases from their parents to just answer questions honestly about intimacy and sexuality. So there you go. So that's all that stuff there. Now, let's go over to the other side about the whole thing about supporting development of all children, supporting development of LGBTQ kids. Okay, what do we know about that? Right. Well, first of all, we know that when an infant is born, it is assigned a gender. Doesn't really get to decide. Somebody else decides for that baby that you are assigned boy or girl. When a child is
based on biology, right? So it's a purely upper right categorization of gender.
Based on secondary sex characteristics. Right. At 14 months, that child discovers whether they're a boy or a girl. Up to that point, but on average, I'm a boy, I'm a girl. Later on, 3, 4, 5, and 6, that kid discovers if they're comfortable self-identifying as a boy or a girl. A certain percentage of the population, somewhere between 1% and 2%, aren't comfortable with their assigned gender. And so they go, I want to be a girl, or I want to be a boy. And so this has been studied. The most recent one is 317 kids who self-identified as trans. Little kids were studied, them and their families were studied over a course of 5 years. The parents were supportive, mostly 2/3 were white, mostly middle class. The kids socially transitioned. There were 3 to 12, the kids that they studied. And the kids socially transitioned at an average age of 6.5. Socially transitioned mean you can grow your hair or cut your hair or wear dresses or, self-identify. 5 years later, 98% of the kids still wanted to be the gender that they chose. 9 of the kids said that they didn't. 1 wanted to be gender fluid and the other 8 wanted to go back. And the parents said, sure, you can go back. And they went back and there were, as far as they can tell, there were no ill effects whatsoever. Okay. Now, this is an important study because it reflects when a kid makes a gender choice, as we've known from the field for a long time, overwhelmingly, they continue to make that choice. Not always. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Mm-hmm. And so in the recent study of, I think it was 19 high schools, 1.8% of the high school students there self-identified as trans, which was unusual. 5 years ago, they thought it was 0.6%. And so somehow it's become more popular to self-identify and more accepted. And that actually causes some concern with people that help adolescents transition. There's a whole controversy of that in the trans community that we'll talk about in a little bit too. That's fascinating to me. And so what I did is I tracked down a psychologist who has helped hundreds of kids transition and who seems very practical. Psychologists tend to be very practical. We're not that ideological really, because we want to help each individual person move forward. And so she's less ideological than the extreme people in the World Trans Organization or the US Trans Organization, where they don't want any blocks to transitioning. And she's against rigid rules that take choices away from the combination of kids, parents, and healthcare professionals. And she got somewhat snapped by her trans organization for that, and she's resigned, one of those things. Now, let's talk a little bit about sex education. Right? We know what healthy sex education is because we had a perfect experiment that's been done over the last 40 years. And here's what the experiment is. In the 70s, in the Netherlands, they said, we're going to let psychologists be in charge of sex education. Now, I admit I have a little bit of a bias here, but I think that was a good idea. Okay? And so we're going to let them design sex education in a way that we think helps kids thrive. So they taught them the biology, they taught them about relationship and empathy and about pleasure and about orgasm. They didn't just teach the kids, they taught parents, brought them together, had conversations about it. Later on, 2 years later, they did analysis. They were observing, and they found that both the boys and the girls thought that sex was something a girl did for a boy. So they changed their training. They said, look, girls' pleasure is just as important as guys' pleasure, and consent is super important. You don't do sex for somebody else. Primarily, you do it for you and for somebody else. And then it began to shift. At this particular point, what happens with the Dutch is at 4, 5, and 6, kids are taught about the biology and about gender and that kind of stuff. Around 8, they're taught about intimacy and what constitutes a good boyfriend or a good girlfriend. By 13 and 14, they've learned specifics about pleasure, masturbation, orgasm, and relationship. And it's not just them, their parents get involved. By 16 or 17, they start having sex about the same age as American kids, 17 or 18. But whereas 70% of American kids said they didn't like the first time, 90% of the Dutch kids said, I really liked it, and it was with somebody I really cared about. The Dutch kids have 1/5 the amount of abortions that the American kids have. Now, in 1981, Orrin Hatch and Jeremiah Denton introduced the Adolescent Family Life Act, which basically mandated abstinence education in the United States. It was a chastity bill. And basically it mandated that we indoctrinate children and try to mind control them into never having sex, never thinking about sex, not talking about contraception, and being critical of other people who do it, okay? And that's been the state of the United States since then. Right now, the CDC, which isn't the most progressive place in the world, has 16 things you're supposed to know about sex. Less than half of high school students in the United States meet those standards, and less than 20% in middle school. The fundamentalists say, well, you should talk about sex at home. 80% of fundamentalist households never have any conversation about sex. Amount of VD in the United States, half of the new VD cases in the United States are people under 24. In the Netherlands, 10%. Okay. Teen pregnancy, way higher in the United States, way lower. So basically, the jury is in. That model is a superior model that produces better relationships, more self-acceptance. An interesting side note of this with trans kids is that when the Dutch taught this stuff, they noticed that trans kids were much less likely to be bullied. And if they were, other kids were much more likely to step in and say, stop it. Which said that basically the culture became more the child culture. 4, 5, 6, third grade, junior high, child culture developed a standard of we don't bully people and we support each other. Okay. United States, the new laws are basically setting the framework of allowing children to bully other children for being gay or trans. And the United States has a long history of oppressing sexual minorities. Homosexuality was in the diagnostic manual as a pathology until 1973. And the reason why it got out is there was this psychiatrist, John Tyler, who is gay, but he had to be in the closet on account of you get discriminated against if you're a gay psychiatrist in those days. And he appeared in a panel with a Richard Nixon mask and a big tuxedo so that he could be anonymous. He was introduced as Henry Anonymous and gave a 10-minute speech, scathing speech to the American Psychiatric Association about what the fuck are we doing pathologizing me and the other 300 people at this conference that are gay and are all in the closet because we're scared of you. Well, God bless them. The next year, homosexuality was not considered a pathology in the diagnostic manual DSM-3.
Wow, that's a sea change.
Yeah, that was a step in the right direction. And I want to give people credit for where credit is due. And there's incredible amount of dedicated sex educators and sex therapists, people all across the country. And I've met them my entire career and so on. And everybody, all those people, and they're in that group, that healthy orange, green, and teal group, and they're working to optimize the development with children. And again, the jury is out. Mandating a situation where you cannot answer a question that a child asks you, and you cannot give validated, peer-reviewed scientific data to a student, or where you can't allow a student to choose a work of fiction to read and react to. Basically, what we're doing is we're heading. Now, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but we're heading in the Soviet Union, North Korea, Iran, China direction, and we're heading away from the Holland, the Dutch direction.